have a quorum yet?
Yes, we can start whenever you're ready.
Okay, then let us call this meeting to order. And I apologize. I had the agenda in front of me just a moment ago, and I'm about to pull it up on an alternative iPad. The first item on the agenda is, what is that?
That's a roll call. So
Okay.
I'll call the roll. It is, let me call the roll. Member Bowman?
Present.
Member Chomsky?
Present.
Member Gray is absent, excuse. Member Tepper is absent, and Chair Schneider.
Present.
Okay, and I apologize, I should have put the land acknowledgement statement on our agenda. I omitted to do that, so let me pull it up and I can share it on the screen, or we can, I can read it too. And I apologize, I should have.
Okay. And then while I'm pulling this up, if you wouldn't mind just advising me of the next item on the agenda.
Sure. I'll go ahead and read the land acknowledgement statement. Starting last November, the land acknowledgement statement shall be read at the beginning of each city council meeting and advisory body meetings per the Albany City Council minutes action on November 15th, 2021. So the land acknowledgement statement states, the City of Albany recognizes that we occupied the land originally protected by the Confederated Villages of Lejeune. We acknowledge the genocide that took place on these lands and must make strides to repay the moral debt that is owed to this indigenous people, specifically the Ohlone tribe. We thank them for their contributions, which have transformed our community and will continue to bring forth growth and unity. The City of Albany commits to sustaining ongoing relationships with the tribe and together build a better future for all that now makes this their home. So the next item is announcements.
Approval of minutes. I did get the.
Oh, I'm sorry. Approval of minutes.
Yes. Do I hear a motion to approve? I don't normally, as the chair, initiate motions. So I was just looking for a motion.
I move to approve the minutes.
I will second that.
Okay.
So member Bowman,
Yeah.
member Chomsky,
Yes.
and Chair Schneider.
Yes.
The motion carries.
All right. And do we have any announcements?
If not, I can, if the members don't have any announcements.
Well, I'd just like to ask about the membership of the committee, which I think has changed since our last meeting. Is this a good time to talk about that?
Yeah, that was going to be part of my announcement.
Oh, okay. I didn't know if you had moved on. Okay, go ahead.
So first of all, I'd like to introduce to you our city staff, Deputy City Clerk John Klaus. He will soon be the staff liaison for the Charter Review Committee. I will, of course, still attend the meeting with him for a few meetings. And then the next one is we do have an appointment to replace member member Danby. However, Tony Gray is his name, but he was originally going to attend tonight's meeting. He had a family emergency that he had to fly to East Coast today. So he said he's going to try to attend, but I don't know how feasible that is, given he might be on the flight. And for that, I also just got an email yesterday or this week that member Pepper stated that he's moving to a different city soon, but I didn't get an indication of when his effective date is, if it's effective immediately or if it's effective in the future, because he said soon. So right now, we will have for sure, hopefully 4 members at the next meeting.
So will member Tepper's membership in the committee just end on the day that he establishes residence in a new city?
Correct. Because advisory body are required to be residents of the city of Albany.
Okay, and there's no grace period for that. Okay.
Okay. And is there any more to the presentation? Okay. Oh, you know what? And there was no one present from the public to comment. And so the next set of items are, the first one is work plan items progress report, where committees members report on progress for the 2 work plan items, which is considering lowering the voting age, at least for school board elections. And then the other is to revisit, to take a look at increasing city council compensation with an eye toward promoting diversity. Does anyone have progress on those work plan items that they would like to report?
Yeah, I can go ahead and share some basically qualitative research I did on lowering the voting age.
Okay.
That's the one I focused on. So I did not focus on the other issue. Happy to dive into that.
Please dive in.
All right. So I think there's really 2 options that we could be looking at. And I think you already mentioned them, Chair, which would be, the first one is just lowering the voting age for municipal elections as a whole in entirety. Second option could be school board only. And there's precedent for doing both of these. I think what I found in terms of the pros of doing this is people generally say the benefits of lowering the voting age and engaging citizens early just outweigh the cons in total. And some of the pros would be just improved civic engagement. You're getting people to initiate a habit or something that we hope would be ingrained as a habit. And a person that votes in their first election that they're eligible for, according to research, is much more likely to continue voting consistently, potentially up to 25% more likely to vote in the next election. Today, also related to the civic engagement, I think there's a lot of research showing that younger voters are significantly dissatisfied with the state of democracy. You could probably guess why, given just current events of the last few years and some of the challenges that we've had. Again, related to civic engagement, we're talking about capturing voters when they're 16 and 17 and they're in high school, they're learning about government. Some of the efforts that have already taken place to lower the voting age have suggested that the school district itself should be involved in voter registration and civic education as part of the curriculum. And then adults of that age are more likely to be entrenched in the community and have roots in the community compared to when they're turning 18, they're more likely to be potentially going to college or moving away from their family, and that can complicate their residency and where they actually should be voting, or they might have to vote via absentee. So that can discourage new voters. So the argument here is saying at 16 and 17, we're more likely to pull people in at a time that they're more stable. So that piece is all around like civic engagement. There's also suggestions that 16 and 17-year-olds are affected by the outcomes of laws that they would be voting on, and they're affected by the issues. They can work, they can pay taxes, they can drive, they can donate blood, they can be tried as an adult for a felony in an adult court. So essentially, they're expected to follow the law, but they don't really have any say in making it. And then with regards to schools specifically, if they're able to vote on the school board, they're actually students in the schools. So of course they're elected or affected by who they elect to the school board. There's an argument about just overall knowledge of the issues. While that's not a criterion for the population at large being eligible to vote, in other words, knowledge of individual issues isn't something that we test the population at large on. There are studies that suggest that people of this age are actually more informed about day-to-day issues because they're entrenched in the community and learning about civics while they're in school. Again, especially with school-related issues and the school board because they're in school. And then I think one of the major arguments that you would see against lowering the voting age is about development. And one of the counters to that is cold cognition, which is essentially making unhurried, deliberate decisions on one's own, relying on logical reasoning, matures around the age of 16 and doesn't actually improve beyond that age. And then that full development of the brain actually doesn't occur until age 25, yet we're allowing 21-year-olds to vote. So currently the voting age isn't really grounded in that full development, and cold cognition actually develops by the age of 16. And then lastly, I just looked at supporters that have come out in favor of doing this or lowering the voting age. So you have Nancy Skinner, our Senate representative in District 9. You have Barbara Lee, our U.S. representative. You have Nancy Pelosi. You have former presidential candidate Andrew Yang. You have the mayor of Berkeley, Jesse Aragon, and then the Berkeley School Board president back in 2016 when this was on the ballot in Berkeley. Any questions about the pros? I'll also dive into the cons here. And then I also wanted to talk about some of the precedent that has existed in some places that have done this.
I do have a question about the pros, about increasing the possibility that people will continue to vote. Is there any real data showing that dropping the age to 16 produces long-term increases in the propensity to vote?
So yes, Denmark is one of the countries that has changed the age to, I believe, 16. And in Denmark, or at least the study came out of Denmark, it basically showed that individuals who started voting at a lower age were more likely to vote in their next election. Basically, the earlier the age of your first vote, every month that someone voted earlier, or every month that they started voting later, made them less likely to vote in their next election. So the earlier you engage someone, the better. And then I need to look at the source for this second statistic, but the stat here was a person who votes in their first election they're eligible for is more likely to continue voting consistently in their next election by 25%. So that one came from Yale, and I have to look at the details, but yeah, essentially the argument is the earlier in one's life that you can ingrain this habit, the more likely they are to become a lifetime voter. And then getting them to vote in that first election, which is more likely if someone is stable, hasn't moved away from where they've grown up and has to deal with absentee ballots and residency, the more likely they are to vote in that second election.
And then the data that you saw about the development of cold cognition and then full development, are there any differences by gender?
I did not see anything in this initial pass, but happy to look back into that.
I'm just wondering about that.
Any other questions there? I'll share with the committee some of these studies, and then a full document basically outlining the pros and cons, so we can all take a look at those independently.
And also about proponents, are you seeing signs of proponents within the city of Albany?
I did not find anything publicly yet, either for or against the issue within the city of Albany. And most of what I found related to Nancy Skinner, Barbara Lee, Mayor Jesse in Berkeley, and then the Berkeley School Board president was related to the fact that Berkeley actually lowered the voting age to 16 for school board elections in 2016. It's just yet to be implemented. So in 2016, a number of these folks penned a letter in support of the issue. And then there's also been a bill introduced in the US House, and which Barbara Lee and Nancy Pelosi voted for.
And Berkeley, has that been actually implemented yet?
So it has not been implemented yet, and I'll get into why.
Okay.
Any other questions on the pros?
I was just going to suggest that if you have those studies to share, you can go ahead and send it to me, and then I can add it to as an attachment to the to tonight's agenda.
Great. And we'll go ahead and do that. Okay, so some of the cons here, the arguments against lowering the voting age, are centered around lack of maturity and development. So people are arguing that people of this age are potentially uninformed. They don't lack the political knowledge or interest in voting at that age. It's also suggested, as I mentioned earlier, that the brain isn't fully developed. I didn't see anything saying the brain would be fully developed at 21. Most of the information that I saw around that point suggested the prefrontal cortex develops during adolescence, and that fully finishes at the age of 25. There's also an argument around consistency with other milestones. So that person is not yet legally an adult until they reach the age of 18. They are also typically still in high school. So 18 coincides with their graduation and moving into essentially likely full-time work or higher education. It's also 18 is also consistent with being able to serve in the military, although 17-year-olds can serve with parental consent. And then 18 is the legal age to smoke, and 21 is the legal age to drink alcohol. There's also cons related to low turnout, suggesting 18 to 29-year-olds that can vote today have extremely low turnout. And while that had increased in 2020, it was still much, much below those of higher ages, particularly those ages 16 up. So 17 and 16-year-olds might be even less likely to vote. And then cost and implementation. So the voter databases that typically exist today are built for people 18 and up, and the systems and the databases would need to be modified, including the machines that actually recognize who's eligible. And then if we're thinking about allowing folks to only vote in municipal elections or school board elections, you're potentially talking about different ballots, which is an expense in itself. And then voting machines that can recognize that there's two ballots, one with the full list of all the issues and candidates, and one with the truncated list of all the issues and candidates for 16 and 17-year-olds. So that second issue has been, from what I found, one of the main reasons why Berkeley in particular hasn't yet implemented this. And I'll get into that precedent in a second here, but one opponent that I found of lowering the voting age here was San Francisco Chronicle editorial board put out a statement prior to this being on the ballot in San Francisco in 2020. Any questions about the cons, and then I'll go into the precedent, including Berkeley, Oakland, and San Francisco, which have all had movement on this issue.
This isn't a full con. Oh, was someone else trying to speak?
No, my doorbell just rang.
Yeah, I just wanted to note that there is a provision in the charter that says that school board elections, this is 6.01A, shall be held in the same manner and time as for the members of the council. And so this may, the manner may mean that it would have to be all one way or all the other. And then of course there would still be, state and national elections, and we don't have the ability to change the rules on those. So that there would be typically multiple ballots.
So if this
in general election, if there are other items on the ballot.
If this went to a vote to change the charter, we would potentially need to change that line as well.
Yeah, and that might
around the same manner.
And that might have some implications that I don't fully understand. I know that when we were years ago looking at tweaking some things, and I'm sorry, I can't remember all the details, changing one little piece would have far-reaching implications in terms of the incumbents and some other things like that. So we really want to explore what that would entail as part of going forward. I'm sorry, I can't be more specific, but that would need to be looked into.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a question about the costs that you mentioned. Do you know what entity is responsible for paying whatever additional costs arises? Are those county costs or city costs?
I think that would depend on what's actually put on the ballot. So in Berkeley, for instance, the issue on the ballot actually restricted city funds from being used to cover the cost and suggested the school district itself needed to be involved. And then in Oakland, that particular provision was not specified. And there's an estimate that it would cost $7,000 to $10,000 more a year to implement this during years that a school board is on the ballot. So,
And is that costs that the city then has to pay out of its budget rather than being borne by the county election?
I believe so, but I'm not
Agency.
positive.
Okay.
Maybe I think it could be helpful if I dive into this precedent because I think this is particularly relevant. So just broad scale internationally, there's precedent for this in Austria. That was the first in 2008. They lowered the voting age to 16. And then notably at either national or state level, some of the notable countries that have moved to 16 have been Brazil, Argentina, Germany, and Scotland in some capacity. Domestically, the first city to do this was Tacoma Park, Maryland, which looks like a suburb of the DC area. They lowered the voting age for all municipal elections in 2013 to 16. And in the first elections, they had 16 and 17-year-olds voting at twice the rate of 18 to 24-year-olds. 3 other cities in Maryland followed: Hyattsville, Greenbelt, and Riverdale Park. And then 1 other, Glen Arden Park, lowered and then re-raised the age back to 18 a year later. I did not find an explanation as to why or how. More locally, Berkeley had this on the ballot in 2016 to change the age for school board elections, so slightly more narrow. In 2016, it was measure Y1 and it passed that with 70% of the vote. The intent was for that to be effective in 2018, but there are some logistical complications with the voting machines. So what I was mentioning earlier about the voting machines being able to distinguish birth dates and multiple ballots. So they weren't able to resolve that and then put it on hold until 2020. And in 2020, the pandemic hit and there was a big push to have all ballots go to mail. And again, they put it on hold to just ensure that we had a smooth vote by mail election. So it's not yet been implemented. And the ballot measure itself restricted the city funds from being used to cover the cost. So I think one of my recommended next steps would be to reach out to the folks that are involved in this issue in Berkeley or informed about what's going on and figure out exactly what is the status quo, because that would obviously inform what Albany does, considering same county and it's the neighboring city. And then Oakland had basically an identical measure on its ballot in 2020, measure QQ. It also passed with about 70% of the vote. This one is what was estimated to cost $7,000 to $10,000 more a year during the school board years, and has not yet gone into effect because it just passed in 2020. And I don't believe there was a school board election in 2021. So,
Was that estimate, was there also an estimate for initial costs, or is that just the ongoing additional
it
costs?
sounds like it's ongoing. I would imagine this has to do with producing additional ballots and calibrating machines or something. And then San Francisco had this measure on the ballot to lower the voting age to 16 for all municipal elections, so not just school board. It was on in 2016 and failed by 4%. And then in 2020, it got 49.2% of the vote in favor. It needed 50% or more to pass, so it failed. I think those are the most relevant analogs. And there's also a number of other cities around the country that are considering this, considering revisions to the city charters. Like Somerville, Massachusetts was the most notable one that I saw, which neighbors Cambridge, Massachusetts. So yeah, I think my recommended next steps here are identify exactly what the status is in Berkeley and Oakland, especially Berkeley since it passed 4 years ago, and some of the hangups in actually implementing this there could be relevant to implementing this here. And then second next step might be getting input from folks in Albany, like the school board, to the extent that we can do that.
I have a couple more questions from what you said. I'm not sure if you have all the answers, but I'll put the questions out there. One is, when Berkeley didn't implement this change that was approved in a ballot initiative, does the city have the right to just not do what the voters approve? Is there something about the way the initiative was written that gave the city staff the option to postpone it? Or was there did anybody get in trouble because of this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I did not see actually any reference to that. And I mean, this is mostly web research and articles that have been published. I definitely saw frustration with student groups at like Berkeley High School, for instance, that were pushing for this. I think one of the challenges, though, with continued opposition is people turn 18 eventually. So they cycle out of the affected age here and become eligible to vote. So I think we could, in doing additional research on Berkeley, try and understand if there's any repercussions to neglecting to implement this.
Another question is, do you have any understanding of why the vote in support of the initiative was so different in San Francisco than in the East Bay cities?
My guess is just the scope was different. So in San Francisco, it was all municipal elections, and in Berkeley and Oakland, it was the school board.
Okay. So it seems like it's a much harder lift to get people to approve it for
I mean,
elections.
I could make the argument that they should be able to vote on the school board because they're in the schools and definitively affected by issues that affect the schools.
Yeah, I mean,
I can see how that would sway more people over.
I can see that would sway more people. I'm a little startled that it made for 70% in favor as opposed to 49% in favor. That's a really wide
I don't know how much sway the Chronicle had, but I did find that op-ed against the issue. So it's entirely possible that influenced some folks as well.
Okay. Well, that's it for my questions. Is this a good time for public comment, or did Chair Schneider have anything more to talk about first?
I think my main issue with this is that I just am not perceiving that there is a demand for this in Albany. And I don't think it's our role to manufacture demand. It's our role to, be listening to people. So that's a concern that I have. And a suggestion that I have about the issue of is it feasible, or the issues that Berkeley has been encountering with the ballot issues and the machines and stuff is perhaps there's a way to reach out directly to election officials to find out what the feasibility is and what the costs would be for Albany. I mean, it's fine to talk to people in other cities, but I don't know whether there might be a more direct way to get that information about what could be implementation costs or barriers for Albany if it were to go in that direction.
Yeah, I certainly like that idea of understanding. Maybe it's the Alameda County Board of Elections or someone exactly what would need to be done here. Yeah, I think overall, I saw a lot of merit in the pros here of there not being significant risk here, but there being a lot of reasons why this might be good for civic engagement and reach people at a better time without negative repercussions of allowing people of that age to vote in something like the school board. But my main concern is also what seems to be plaguing at least Berkeley. I don't know about Oakland, given it passed more recently, in terms of the cost of implementing this, which I would like to learn more about personally.
Before we get too much farther, I want to hear from our city clerk and also find out if there's public comment.
So would you like to hear public comment first, or?
Oh, it's up to the chair.
Well, if Anne, or did you have a particular question for Anne?
No, I just saw her hand was up in Zoom.
Oh.
Yeah, so I was just going to offer what I know in terms of the question that Member Chomsky raised about whether the county register voter take any of those cover any of those fees. As far as I know, for all the elections, county registrar, I mean, we consolidate with county registrar voter, and it's a consolidated election. They administer the election. They pass on all the costs to us in terms of ballot, printing of the information guide, all kinds of whatever costs that it incurs to them. And on years when school board have their measures, or I'm sorry, if they have their candidates, I pass on those costs to the school board. So what I'm trying to say is they probably are not covering any fees. And then Member Bowman mentioned about Berkeley's ballot, if I remember correctly. Actually, let me just share this real quick. Not sure if you can see it. So this is the text of the measure of the Berkeley, and this is the Berkeley Y1 in 2016. The text of the measure specified that no city fund could be used, and then the voting has to be technically workable. That's talking about the equipment, and would not prevent consolidation with county elections, and would not result in any increase in election costs to the city. So I don't know for sure. Of course, it would be probably very useful to reach out to the city of Berkeley to find out exactly what's the reason. But assuming based on what I just said about county doesn't cover any of those costs and does pass on all the costs to the city, that there will be extra costs incurred.
Yeah, and that's consistent with everything that I saw. So Berkeley had that statement in its measure. Oakland did not, and I saw reference to the costs of implementation potentially falling on the school the school district, but I'm not sure how that's different than the city. So I think I certainly have more to learn on exactly how they expected to fund this.
But it's clear there were a number of escape hatches in the language of the ballot measure that explain why it was possible for them to not
To
implement
not do it, yeah.
in the first
I
year.
guess
So
that answers your earlier
that answers
question.
part of my question. So thanks.
And if you're ready for public comment, Chair?
Yes, please open that up.
Hi, good evening. My name's Jeremiah. Yeah, so I was wondering a couple things about the 16-year-olds being able to vote. I know it didn't pass. To me, that's unfortunate because those people potentially would be 18 years of age, when the people they elect will be in office when they're 18. So yeah, they should have a right to vote. I think that's great. Plus, you know what? It encourages younger people to start voting. Basically, we're not going to get every 16 and 17-year-old to vote. It's not going to be 100%. So the cost of mailings or mail outs, I don't know how much. Oh, and then the cost of everything. I was wondering if there's a state grant. I don't know. We're talking about local elections, municipal elections, county, city. I don't know. Maybe the state can throw something in there, but not 100% sure. So this is really interesting. I'm just kind of focusing on the 16 age voter rights. I think that's wonderful. I'm not sure how we could try it again. I hope it's not something like if you try it once and it fails and it doesn't pass. I hope it doesn't prevent us from trying it again. So yeah, I'd say let's give that another shot. If there's any way to write it up, I'm not sure if probably most likely it was a measure or it never got to that point, right? I'm not sure. But anyway, let's try again for that. I think that's great. It definitely encourages younger people to start getting involved, and being an American citizen. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Is there anyone else from the public?
No, that's it.
Okay.
Well, I'd like to take a minute to thank Councilmember Bowman for a really excellent presentation. You did your homework and really got a lot of good information for us and got it organized in a really compelling way. And I appreciated your balancing of the pros and cons and not just looking at one side of the issue. I think you made a really strong case. I wanted to ask Chair Schneider about your comment that you don't see the demand for this coming from the community. What would it look like to you if there were demand from the community? Like in what forum would you expect people to say that they want this?
Well, I wouldn't be dictating any forums, but
how would we know if there were demand from the community? Like if people were privately thinking this, where would they be talking about it, and how would we hear about it? I'm not really sure if there's a good answer. I'm just curious
Yeah, it's hard to talk about negatives, right? But I can say that in our prior committee meetings, when we were discussing what we wanted to have on the work plan, I was asking the members of this committee if they were hearing or aware of demand within the city of Albany for this, and I wasn't hearing that from the other committee members. So I can't say, I can't prescribe a list of forums that would be acceptable. I personally am not aware of this. I wasn't in prior terms when this committee, as previously constituted, was looking at it, there wasn't a lot of evidence of, big demand. So and that initiative sort of petered out in the prior charter review committee. So I'm open to hearing it from, the community in any way, shape, or form. But at this point, I'm just not aware of demand.
Yeah, I guess I guess I'm more comfortable saying that I'm not really aware of a lot of demand or of a lack of demand. It's sort of hard to tell where the community stands on this. I'm not convinced that people dislike the idea. I'm not convinced that people don't care about the idea. I think we've heard from a few people who have taken the time to come to these meetings and spoken in favor of it. It's a very small number of people and is not necessarily a representative sample. So it's really, I think it's just hard to get a sense of how people feel about this, yes or no, and B, how important is it to people? Is it something that people really are going to campaign for and tell their friends to vote for, or is it something that people are going to ignore?
Yeah, I think it is true that we now, including today, have heard multiple members of the public, and we typically don't have very many members of the public on these calls in the first place, express support for the issue. I'll be honest, I went in impartial to this and without a pre-existing notion, and learning more about it. I have come, my preliminary conclusion is that I do think that the benefits here outweigh the cons because the cons are relatively low risk. That being said, I think there's some practical considerations that I'd like to learn more about with why this hasn't moved forward in a place like Berkeley that tried to make headway 4 years ago. And I guess with respect to whether or not there's demand, I think it's kind of hard for us to know that without surveying 16 to 18-year-olds or whatnot in Albany High School. And I'm mostly concerned with trying to do what I think would be the right thing to do and enfranchise people that are potentially affected by the laws that are being put in place by the city, or at least the policies that are being put in place by the school board that affect them. And even still, 16 to 18-year-olds would make up a very small minority of the overall populace voting for the school board. So it's not like we enfranchise them and 16 and 17-year-olds vote for no class or something like that. I don't know. I saw the risk to be relatively low initially, and I'd still like to learn more.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about risk, to me, the biggest risk is that we put energy into putting this initiative on the ballot and we don't really mount an effective campaign. The people who support it don't really mount an effective campaign. It loses like in San Francisco, and then it's kind of discouraging. It feels like the city council has lost some political capital by putting their name on something that then fails. That I think in some ways that feels to me like a bigger risk than, I don't think the downsides of having it pass are really significant. I think the cost is probably pretty small, financial cost. And I think your presentation made it clear that some of the ethical or philosophical arguments against it don't necessarily stand up very strongly. So I'd be all in favor of having it pass. The question is, is it a good idea to go through the motions of putting the initiative on the ballot?
And I know that our public commenter spoke to this. Just to clarify for everyone, I don't believe it's been on the ballot in the past in Albany. It was on the ballot in San Francisco in 2016 and failed, but that didn't stop them from putting it on the ballot again in 2020, and it gained a higher portion of the vote. I think it went from 47% or something like that to 49% and change. And that was for voting in all municipal elections, not just the school board. It sounds like the school board potentially has higher support in the public. What I did find that San Francisco has passed is voting for non-citizens. So non-citizens have a separate ballot in San Francisco, and some of the proponents in Berkeley were pointing to that as evidence that the voting machines can be adjusted to tabulate two separate ballots, one for citizens and one for non-citizens. So that's another flavor of this that's been considered across the country.
Do you have an opinion about whether it's a better tactic to try to pass this for the school board only, or to try to pass it for all municipal elections?
I at this point, I would see it to be challenging for Albany to step ahead of what we're seeing in Albany or in Berkeley and Oakland, rather, and open it up more broadly, especially with the failure in San Francisco. I think the argument is most clear that students are affected by what's policies made by the school board. So that seems like the logical place to start if we're taking baby steps and we don't want to move too quickly when we don't know some of the unknowns here. That would be my initial recommendation, because you can always revisit and open it up more broadly after that.
So even if a majority of us on this committee support the idea of opening it up for all municipal elections, we might choose to encourage city council to put the initiative on the ballot just for the school board elections, because it's just a better step to take given where we are right now.
Yeah, I think I think there's definitely more relevant precedent for the school board piece, and it might be easier to execute within Alameda County if all these cities in Alameda County had moved in the direction of a school board specifically. And you have to start somewhere, I guess. So my recommendation for next steps, given everything that we've identified so far, would be, let's see if we can reach out directly to folks that might be involved in elections around questions around implementation here, per the chair's suggestion. I'm also interested in understanding, and it might be folks that were involved in getting this measure passed in Berkeley and Oakland, what the status is, and why hasn't it moved forward. And then if the committee's open to it, we could discuss getting input from members of the Albany School Board. Because I think that question came up from the city council, if I'm not mistaken, when we were proposing our agenda with them, was how do we talk to the school board about this?
So how would we talk to the school board? Would we go into would we try to get it agendized at a school board meeting, or?
I'm not sure. I think I'd defer to Anne on if there's protocol as to how we can do that.
in terms of contacting them regarding of their interests.
Yeah, do we have to do that in a public forum? Can we do that individually? How is there protocol on how we might bring this up?
Well, there is a regular either 2x2 meeting or 2x2x2 meeting, or I think probably the fastest way to get it heard at the for the Board of Education to hear about this is speaking at their public comment time during their school board meeting. And you know, anyone in the community, anyone in the member of the public can request them can make a comment and see if they're willing to put it on the agenda.
School board meetings can be very long and grueling. Do you think the 2x2 meeting is an easier forum, maybe with a less stressful agenda that we could add to?
That is just a meeting between the city manager, city mayor, with the superintendent and the usually the president of the board. It could be brought up, but they can't discuss it to, you know, anything that has to be discussed, just like us, you know, Brown Act meeting, anything that has to be discussed and needs to be in a public meeting.
So there would be no way to really get a straw poll of the school board members' opinions about it in
No,
the
you
2x2 meeting. Okay.
No.
Then it sounds like we have to agendize it.
I mean, there's also the option of writing in if, you know, people.
How would that work?
Don't want to wait for the long meeting at the school board.
How would writing in work?
I think there should be an email address to send them comments. Just like, you know, we have citycouncil@albanyca.org for people to submit comments.
Yeah, but the comment would just be, please put this on your agenda so we can discuss it at a future meeting.
That's up to the pleasure of the committee, what you want.
But we can't do the whole thing we can't write an email to the school board saying, we want to know what you think about this. Please get back to us.
I'm happy to see if we can contact by writing in to put on an agenda and provide background or however they'd like to consider it. But perhaps at first, I think it makes sense to get additional detail on what's happening in Berkeley, because I'm sure those questions are going to come up before folks have solid opinions here. Any other recommended next steps on this topic? And I will also look into some of the follow-up questions that were asked around development differences by gender and the studies themselves about engagement.
Yeah, I have to say some of the studies that you described, they were interesting. They didn't, I don't think they necessarily lead to the conclusion that they sounded like they sounded like the studies were reporting data in support of making this change. But in some cases, I think there could be some built-in bias, like the idea that people who vote in the first election they're eligible for are more likely to continue voting. You'd have to really correlate that with when voting is open to 16 to 17-year-olds. Are they more likely to vote in that first election? And then does the result still hold for them? Like it may be that that's a result that applies to people who are first voting when they turn 18. And if you look at people who first vote when they turn 16, it just didn't seem to me that it necessarily follows that getting people to vote at age 16 and then go off to college, that habit will really stick. Because
Yeah,
I don't think the study really investigated that scenario in enough detail because it just doesn't exist.
There were a number of references to these types of studies, and I didn't dive into them in significant detail. I was just trying to get the gist of the main arguments here. But I will dig those up and share them. A number of them are like lengthy, like academic papers and whatnot. So it can be pleasurable reading.
I just think we have to be really careful in interpreting we can see what the results of the study were, but what that means about policymaking doesn't necessarily follow directly. You always have to take that with a grain of salt. But thank you for looking up the studies, and I think your explanation of them in the presentation you gave tonight was really clear and really compelling. So thanks so much for doing all that.
Thank you.
Shall we move on to the other topic, unless anyone else has anything to add on this item?
I have nothing more. So I did look into what on the council compensation issue. I looked at I obtained a data set that's out there, anyone can get it, from the state on city council and other compensation, and did a little bit of summarization. But before I get into that, I just wanted to give a little bit of background. So in our charter, the section on council compensation essentially says that the charter chose to follow the state's compensation statute for general law cities. And we are a charter city, so we could go in a different direction, but we chose to follow section 36516A, and that sets a series of population tiers. And for the first population tier, which is up to and including 35,000 people, it set a compensation amount of $300 per month per person. And then there are various other tiers, and the highest tier for the large cities is up to $1,000 a month. And then there's a provision that cities can pass an ordinance. This is in the state law. Cities can pass an ordinance permitting up to, I think, 5% annual increases. I don't think that Albany did that, since the compensation still seems to be at $300 a month for the base compensation. And there's also a provision in state law where the voters can choose a different payment scheme. So what I wanted to do, I was to see how Albany stacked up against other cities, and I crunched the data set before I really looked hard at those tiers in the state law, which is the general law cities. So, but I also can walk you through a little last minute crunching that I did using the 35,000 tier. And then Anne included in the materials some summary pivot tables that I did of the data, and also the data itself. And what I did when I was summarizing the data was, even though I was using a data set that was labeled City Council, there was a whole lot of other stuff in it. There were many, many, many values for different types of positions, mayor, clerks, etc. And so I did my best to filter in only city council members So if you were to do this yourself, your results might vary a little bit because there is a little bit of judgment involved in those values. But the data is out there, and feel free to play with it. What I was finding when I did it, I was sort of breaking it up into little cities under 10,000 population, and then cities with a population of 10,000 to 25,000. And then Albany, and this is a 2020 data set. Albany's city population available for this was a little over 17,000 at the time. And then I also just looked at cities that were over 25,000. And so what I was finding is that if you look at the base pay for cities in those middle tier, the 10,000 to 25,000, the average of the base pay, total wages is what they call it, is 5,667. And then if you look at the average per member in Albany, it's 3,600 because we're still going with the $300 a month plan. But then if you look at the additional compensation in the form of total retirement and health contribution, that's what the city pays for premiums for health insurance. The average for that middle tier where Albany sits is in California is 4,390. And then for Albany, it is 8,892. And so the total and I believe that this is likely to be exclusively health insurance. I don't think that there's any retirement. I could be wrong. So if you look at, again, at the statewide average for that middle tier, the combined compensation average is $10,000, a little over $10,000 a year. And then for Albany, it is 12,492. Okay. So that's the data set that you all can see right now. Very recently, after I gave this to Anne, I took another pass. It's not up for y'all to see, but I can send this to Anne. Is I wanted to see what the numbers looked like for that tier, the first tier in the state law, which Albany is following, for cities up to and including 35,000. And so what I was finding there is, I can read through the individual numbers for you, but I think I'll just start with the average total. Again, statewide in that tier, it is 9,184. And then again, for Albany, it is 12,492. Okay.
Can I clarify what that,
sure.
What was that subset again? It was up to 35,000 population, okay, and then following the same type of law as Albany?
Law. This data set does not distinguish between charter cities and general law cities. And it certainly doesn't identify cities like Albany that are charter cities, but chose to follow the general law.
I see.
It's just not in the data set. If anyone happens to have a list of those cities, I can throw it up against this data set and do a little more analysis.
Okay. And just to be clear, the number that you just read, the 9,000, it was population up to 35,000, and then was there another criteria, or it was just like a bigger range?
That was
0 to 35,000.
The set of cities, the data for the cities in that large data set that the state has.
Gotcha.
For cities, right, of that within that population band up to and including 35,000. Yeah. Okay. and then just to go back with a little bit of detail, the base pay average there for the entire state for that band up to and including 35,000 was a little under $5,000, 4,969. And the average of total retirement and health contribution, 4,215, and adding up to that 9,184 total. So what I'm seeing here is that if you look at total compensation, Albany is pretty much in sync with a little bit higher than cities of similar size, and also cities in that 35,000 and under, or 35,001 and under band for the cities that either are general law cities or choosing to follow that, or this could include actually this data set. We can't distinguish the charter cities. So Albany is, bottom line, pretty much in sync with cities of similar size for total compensation. We're a bit below for the base wages, and then we're higher for the additional contribution, which I believe is health insurance by and large. And I also wanted to give you a little bit of background. I found an article or two in the LA Times from way back when, 2011, noting that there's an article, many small cities pay officials hefty health benefits. That was from July 4th, 2011 in the LA Times. It noted that 2/3 of cities at that time provided healthcare benefits, in other words, where the city was contributing all or part of the premiums. And there was some speculation in the article that the impetus for doing this may have been to increase diversity in, I think, the early 2000s. However, at that time, at least the LA Times was not seeing that cities that did not make that contribution, that they had less diverse representation. I'm not sure how they measured diverse representation, but it's just kind of an interesting note that was, I guess, the impetus for cities to start really bulking up on health insurance benefits. And then another bit of context that I would like to give you about that is that this development happened before the Affordable Care Act kicked in. And the Affordable Care Act basically, makes health insurance, you all, have read about Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act, but it does a number of things to make health care more accessible and certainly, and in many cases, more affordable, especially for lower income people through Medicaid expansion, which California did adopt, and also through subsidies for lower income people. It used to be people who are up to 400% of the poverty level would get subsidies. And in recent years, the law has made that more generous. And I think it's people who are spending, sorry, I don't have my notes in front of me, but the current subsidies are even more generous. So that is kind of the background for that. And I'm not drawing lots of conclusions from this at this point. I just wanted to do some gathering of fact. So are there any questions about that?
I just want to say thank you. Super informative data, and putting it in this format that's easily digestible was eye-opening and very helpful. When I just did some cursory research on this issue, I looked up Berkeley again as a comp, and the difference was enormous. I think that was 60,000 per year for
Wow.
city council members, or I mean, I can find it right now. It was like 60, maybe 60,000 for the mayor and city council members in the 40,000 to 45,000, it looks like. So I saw that gap, and but then now I'm seeing this broader range of same size cities as Albany. It's quite lower, and we're actually looks like in line, at least in terms of the total comp here. Looks like we're below on the wages, below the average on the wages, but higher on these ancillary benefits. And I think I'd like to understand what exactly is driving the much higher health contribution in Albany compared to some of these other cities. I don't know if there's a way that we can understand what the health benefits are for city council members and why that might be so much higher compared to some of the comparables here.
Yeah. The LA Times article, which, wasn't addressing Albany per se, but it did indicate that there was kind of a trend. It sounds like in the latter part of the first decade of this century, especially for small cities, to amp up their health insurance costs. And I read either in this article or in another LA Times article that in some cases the medical benefits were richer than the standard for what people were getting through private insurance in the area. So I don't know why small cities were doing that. It might have been that they couldn't, or that their base rates for the paying compensating city council weren't as high for the big cities, and so that's the way they chose to try to even things out and maybe attract people whose employers didn't offer health insurance or weren't employed or whatever. But again, the landscape has really changed since then. One of the features, obviously, of the Affordable Care Act is that large employers, which I think is defined as 100 or more employees, full-time employees, or somewhat less, are required to provide health insurance now. So it's a different landscape now.
One other question I had is just on the fly here. I was looking up some nearby cities like Lafayette and Moraga and Piedmont that are smaller. And several of those at least show the compensation being $0. One is interesting. Maybe they just don't pay their city council members in there. But I'm wondering what the median might be, or what the number might be if we exclude the zeros for the cities that do offer compensation. How does Albany compare?
That data set could be worked in all sorts of ways.
So maybe those are some things that could also be helpful data for us to look at. Like what if we look at the median, because it's the average might be skewed by outliers. And then if we exclude these zeros, what is the average for cities that are compensating their city councils? And then the question of why so many of these are zeros in the first place also begs the question to me, like, why did they decide to do that?
Yeah, they could be charter cities, and they may have decided not to, we're just not going to compensate. The same, another LA Times article of this vintage indicated that even among general law cities, again, this is around 2011, some of them were under what you would expect them to be paying given what the law requires. So, I don't think there's anyone out there, or at least there wasn't at that time, necessarily enforcing. But it could be, I think the more interesting or an interesting thing for me would be if I have a table of all the charter cities in California and could throw that up against the data, because I think that would be illuminating.
And one other follow-up is if you saw anything regarding adjusting the rates for inflation, like any other cities that have done that.
What the law says is that for the general law cities and charter cities that choose to follow it, we chose to follow A. Okay. In subsection 4 of section A, the salary of council members may be increased beyond the amount provided in this subdivision by an ordinance or by an amendment to an ordinance, but the amount of the increase shall not exceed an amount equal to 5% for each calendar year from the operative date of the last adjustment of the salary in effect when the ordinance or amendment is enacted. No ordinance shall be enacted or amended to provide automatic future increases in salary, that's kind of hard to wrap my mind around. But again, the LA Times was interpreting that to mean you can, by ordinance, you can go up to 5% per year. I was sort of wondering why they didn't use like a CPI index, consumer price index or something like that, but the general law does not do that.
Yeah, it sounds like they're explicitly forbidding pegging it to inflation, because that would be an automatic ongoing increase, and the law says you can't enact that. But again, is that law applies to general law cities, and charter cities can choose to ignore that restriction?
Well, Albany, what Albany did was our provision basically adopts Part A.
But we could change that in a ballot initiative.
There are a couple of things that could happen. I believe it would be the city council could pass an ordinance saying that they want to start doing the 5% increases. Okay. I don't think there would be any catch up that would be happening there, but given the way subpart 4 is written, there is also subpart B, which Albany did not adopt in the charter as far as I can tell, but there's a general law provision saying that there can be a municipal election and people can choose. Another thing is we can change the charter.
I mean,
if we want to change the compensation amount.
The question about whether their $300 a month is fair aside, I think there's reasonable merit to look into providing inflation-oriented adjustments. I just did some back of the envelope math here, and the 3,600 went into effect in 2008. Is that right?
I think that let's see.
2010.
2010 okay. In our charter.
Because 3,600, if you adjust that by 3% annual inflation, in 2022, that number would be 5,100. So I think that to me is a stark difference in terms of how much 3,600 has been devalued over time, and warrants us taking a look at this.
I'm not sure that the CPI has been that high between 2010 and 2020. I think it is higher than that right 2%. Now, but I think in general it's been pretty low for the past decade.
Then it gets to 4,600 by 2022. If it's 2%. So there's still a delta here, and I think just given the environment, I think inflation is on people's minds. So I'm just raising this as I think this could be interesting to take a look at to see what precedent there is for indexing to an average of the CPI for the last decade or something as part of the way to ensure that this, I mean, it's eventually going to get out of date 20 years from now. $300 a month is going to be even far more devalued. So we could take an opportunity and fix it, take it to some level that seems reasonable.
Yeah, and that would be a charter amendment because under the provision as it is now, adopting part of the state law, we couldn't do it. But,
and the guise of the environment where inflation is making the news, I could see this as something that would be relatively palatable to voters in 2022. To peg something to a number that at least in 2022 is well below inflation if it's like 2 or 3%.
And just one other thing that I was saying, and you would notice that if you were to look at the data tab that has all the detail in it, is that there's real variability. At least there was in 2020 of how much each city council person was receiving as far as the retirement and health contribution. And again, we think it's probably mostly health contributions. So it fluctuates. And it also presents kind of an unknown for the city because the city's expenditure could be high in certain years or for certain groups of council members and low in other years. So I am, when I looked at this, one thought I had was that it might make sense to look into reducing the healthcare contribution, given the fact that the Affordable Care Act has made healthcare more accessible and often more affordable for people compared to what it was before when Albany adopted this, and shifting some of those dollars to base compensation.
I would agree with that. I'm interested in seeing if we can identify exactly what the health package looks like. And if most people have another job, they could have health coverage coming from 2 places.
Which I think is why we're seeing some people taking nothing or little.
Yeah.
Other sources of health insurance.
So I would second looking into that option of shifting the money to the salary component, especially if we're putting in place some sort of like permanent fix or adjustment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. I'm just sort of, there could be, we could decide that it makes more sense to propose increasing the base compensation and leaving the health insurance alone. I was just putting out there as a possibility that might be more palatable now that people have more options as far as healthcare goes. And in California, they are likely to continue having that no matter what happens nationally.
It sounds like we're easing into a discussion about opinions and pros and cons. And before we get too far into that, I'd like to hear public comment.
Yes, I agree. If there's someone out there who would like to speak. Is there anyone? I'm sorry, in my view, I can't see whether anyone is raising their hand.
Yes, hand is setting up for Jeremiah to speak.
Okay.
Hi, Ann. Good evening. It's Commissioner Garrett Pinguello. I just had a couple questions for the Charter Review Committee. I know we're talking about the city council's pay or whatever it's called. I was wondering, all the city council subcommittees, I noticed each subcommittee, they get $75 for this one, $200 for that one. I don't know. What's the why so many differences in the subcommittee prices, and why are there some subcommittees that get paid, and why are there other subcommittees that don't get paid? It's kind of interesting. Yeah, I was actually unaware that any council members actually do get paid. I thought it was kind of a volunteer thing. But yeah, I know there's such thing as the light fare, which is money for food before a city council meeting if it starts too early. That is so interesting. Every city council member gets what is the light fare? $25 or something like that. But it's so yeah, I don't know. I mean, why doesn't just a restaurant on Solano donate a meal to the city council as like an act of good faith, or like maybe City Albany could be saving money on light fares, because that's how many council members? There's 5. That's $125 every 2 weeks. It's like $250 a month for food for council members. I would suggest that maybe the food can come from the food bank, Alameda County Food Bank, Berkeley Food Network or something. Or maybe a good council member might donate their light fare to a homeless person. Wouldn't that be something? If we had a leader of our community, donate their light fare to someone less fortunate. Oh man, what a great leader that would be. What a great leader. But I don't know. Right now, still taking the money, eating the food. But yeah, maybe there's a state grant for all this. I know it's local elections, local municipalities. Maybe there's a state, federal grant. Probably not. So, all right. It's a tough one.
That's
Thank you.
it.
Anyone else from the public?
No, that's it.
I have a few thoughts about all this. I really appreciate the great presentation.
Could I interrupt you for just a moment? I wanted
Sure.
to get some clarity from Anne. Some of the things I was hearing were not related to any items on the agenda. Are we allowed to comment on those?
No, but I think his question, if you were referring to his question about the subcommittees,
Mm-hmm.
is that what you were referring to?
Snacks, food, and also subcommittee pay.
Yeah. Yeah, we can't be discussing the item, but if as a quick answer, those are regional bodies, and they're not something that's authorized. It's not money from the city. It's from the other agency that are authorizing those funds.
Does that apply to the food reimbursement cost as well as the subcommittee?
No, the light fare is something in the council's procedures and policies. But we have not had that since the pandemic because all the meetings are virtual. So the light fare is providing some light snack if the council meeting starts before 6 o'clock.
So it's not providing money for the council members to get their own food. It's providing the food in kind. Okay. All right. And the subcommittee pay that Jeremiah was talking about was pay for city council members who participate in regional bodies rather than in smaller subcommittees of the city council.
Yes, it's not subcommittees. It's regional bodies.
Okay.
And so I think I interrupted Member Chomsky. You were starting talk, and then I just
Yeah.
wanted to add.
No,
Sorry.
I appreciate
Uh-huh.
getting the facts straightened out before we
Uh-huh.
jump into opinions. So I guess my thoughts about all this are basically to try to make sure our discussion stays oriented around the question of not so much around what's the right pay or what's a fair amount of pay, but the question of what amount of pay would make it more likely for lower income people to feel able to participate as city council members. Because I think that's, for me, that would be the goal of this. I don't think we need to increase city council pay because the current pay is unfair or something like that. I think the reason that I'm interested in this topic is because it seems that people who choose to take time out of their week to participate in city government like this tend to be people who are either retired or fairly well-to-do or have something of a financial cushion to work with and don't need to be working a lot of hours, and they can easily afford the time to do this. And that leads us to a something of a lack of diversity in our city council. And I think the main goal of this discussion for me is there a change we could make that would lead to a more diverse city council that would more reflect the socioeconomic levels of the city as a whole. So with that in mind, I just had a few observations about the data that you compiled, which is really great, and I appreciate the time and organization that you put into that. One is that when I saw some cities that had zero wages, I was interested in that too. The ones that I happened to notice were Piedmont, Lafayette, and Moraga, just because they're the ones that were mentioned. And those are all pretty wealthy cities. So does anybody know if that's generally the case, that the places that have chosen not to pay their city council members at all are the ones where it's assumed that everybody in town is so wealthy that they don't need the money, or that they can easily volunteer for something like this?
I'm speculating, and it seems like that could be part of it. The reason I looked up those four was because I knew they were smaller. I added four because Orinda also falls into that bucket. So you have Orinda, and then Piedmont, and then I think I looked up Alameda, city of Alameda, but now I can't find it again because the county and the city have the same name and it's hard to search on.
Oh yeah, I see what you mean.
But I think that could be a factor that we should consider. Oh, Alameda does pay. Looks like the range is, I don't know why it differs per person, but it's 2,000 to 8,000 in the salary. And then the health benefits look much lower.
I'm looking at Colma, and it seems to be about in that state average level of 12,000. Actually, it's fairly high because then there's retirement that's in the 20,000s. Or retirement and health. Yeah. Anyway, that was one of my few thoughts. The second one was that when we think about total wages versus health contributions, those may be kind of equal in how they affect the city budget, like how much of a burden it places on the city to provide that compensation. But when we think about trying to foster a more diverse council, I do want to emphasize what Chair Schneider was saying about the Affordable Care Act, that if we choose to lower our health contribution, it's likely that lower income people who might who might choose to be on or might succeed in being on city council would get the sponsorship of their healthcare some other way, either through a job that they have, or through Medicaid, or through premium subsidies on the Affordable Care Act exchanges. And so, in a way, for us to lower the health contribution doesn't so much take those benefits away from the people who might be receiving, who might be serving on the council, as it shifts the cost away from our city government to other larger institutions that might be better equipped to provide for that cost. So I do think it's kind of a vestige of the old days that we thought providing a generous health compensation was a good way to make serving on the council more fair for lower income people. I think since the Affordable Care Act, that doesn't really hold much weight anymore. And I'm wondering if there's anything in the law that would obligate us to continue providing such generous health benefits, or can we just turn that off anytime we want to?
In which law?
Either in state law or in the Affordable Care Act itself, or in the way the city ordinances are written. Like it. So I mean, I know large employers are required to pay health insurance, but I assume Albany city government doesn't fall under that requirement, right? For these very part-time employees. Or is there any kind of a union agreement, or is there anything in place that's causing us to continue that extremely high health contribution, or is it just an oversight that we never thought about reducing it since the Affordable Care Act was passed?
Yeah, well, I'm obviously not going to give legal opinions or advice or anything. I can't pull up the raw data page because my iPad is in use right now. But if you're seeing cities with zeros in the healthcare and retirement column, that would tell you that they're not providing it, and maybe they're not required to provide it.
I don't think I've seen, well, yeah, actually there are some with high salary, high wages, and zero health contributions.
Yeah, and again, as of this LA Times article, which was, a decade ago, that they made a statement that it wasn't a requirement, but some cities were choosing to do it. I think about 2/3 of California cities at that time, which means that 1/3 of the California cities were not providing healthcare, or at least not contributing toward the premiums.
Okay, well that seems like a good opportunity then to reallocate some of that money and put it into wages where it would actually be more useful, I think, in fostering a more diverse city council. Putting all that money into health insurance may have some benefits for some people, but I don't think it goes as far in helping lower income people be able to afford being on the council. And the final point I wanted to bring up is that there's been some suggestion that we look into a sliding scale for the city council wages, where people who have higher income from other sources would automatically get a lower wage for serving on the city council, and people who would. So I think this is tricky to implement, and I'm not sure it's a good idea. I just wanted to put it out there so we don't forget to talk about it. I guess when I think of how are things like this managed in other situations, there's a few answers. One is, well, we pay everybody, but people who have higher incomes fall into higher tax brackets, and they give, if they earn somewhat more money for additional service like city council, they give a large percentage of it back to the government in taxes. That's the way it works in theory. I think since the tax revolts in our country in the last several decades, that doesn't necessarily work out in practice. The other examples I'm aware of paying or treating people's finances differentially depending on their income all have to do with costs, like how much you have to pay for your electricity bill or your water bill, or in some places in the world, how much you have to pay for traffic fines can be pegged to your income. But it's really hard to think of examples of a case where you're doing some extra work, a small part-time job, and the pay you get for that job is reduced for people who have higher incomes. I just don't know if there's much precedent for anything like that.
And it may not even be legal, so we don't know that.
I agree with it sounding challenging to implement, especially from year to year. Someone could have fluctuations in their income or lose their job, and then how do we or change jobs?
And the tax
How do
code
you
has
adapt to that?
The tax code has all kinds of release valves for situations like that, where you pay you get the wrong amount of childcare premium one year, and then you have to pay it back the next year or something like that, and it leads to all kinds of complications and problems and arguments in Congress and things like that. So I'm not sure that we're not really equipped to solve those problems.
If I may, one thing that I noticed looking back at the file is, while the wages are $3,600 for each of the council members and then $4,800 for the mayor, the health benefits vary drastically. The lowest is $0, and then one is almost $25,000, and then the others are in between. There's 2,000, 2,000, 700. Do we know why this is? 25,000 for one person is quite dramatic.
I don't know for a fact, but I have heard that there are different types of plans. There are kind of richer plans, maybe the equivalent of like gold level plans. I think there's a base Kaiser plan that is less expensive. So it could be that the city chips in more for, if someone is choosing a really expensive plan, with PPO benefits and, low co-insurance or something. It could also be a matter of whether dependents are being covered or not. So there are a number of things, the type of plan chosen and the extent of the family coverage that might make a difference.
Do we know of a way to understand what's going into these numbers? That question may be for Anne or John.
Is that confidential personnel file information, or is that public?
No, I mean, it's just that I don't know the answer off the top of my head. That would be something that I probably would need to check with our HR to see why that is. And Lisa, Chair Schneider, did you get this information from Transparent California or?
I can't honestly remember. This could have been from years ago when there was a time when the city council, I think, was being offered richer health insurance benefits than staff, and there was a lot of discussion at that time. So,
I'm just looking at the website, the state website that was listed in the document that Chair Schneider shared with us, which is publicpay.ca.gov. I assume that's what Member Bowman is looking at too. If you search for Albany on that page, you can see that the total wages are basically the same for everybody, but the health contribution varies between
Mhm.
0 and 25,000 with a couple of numbers in the middle. So
Mhm.
I
that
can
is
definitely-
emphasizing even more how
Mhm.
kind of out of whack the system is where the city is paying for health insurance. And it seems like it's offering different product with different value for different people that's not necessarily correlated with how much they actually need it.
I can definitely check with our HR and bring back information. Also, I'm actually looking at a staff report from 2015 of the city council where they talked about city council health benefit. There were discussions around, if I remember correctly, council members returning that money to the city if they have insurance cover from a different source. So that might explain the 0, but I don't know for sure since I do need to check with HR. And part of this report also says the costs incurred are impacted by the enrollment status, i.e. the number of dependent cover the plan selected.
Mhm. I just wanted to do a quick time check. Does this meeting go until 9?
At 9, usually you have to make a motion to extend if need to be.
Okay, and there's a couple more agenda items, one main agenda item left. Do we want to wind up conversation now and then move on to the next agenda item and then extend if we need to?
That's fine with me.
Mhm.
If the next step, one of the next steps here is to see if we can get that any more information here from HR as to what's going into this. I'd just like to learn more about
The drivers for
the drivers before I start recommending or not recommending changes.
Perhaps I can check with HR and come back with at least what the current current compensation is in terms of wage and benefit.
Yeah, and any drivers of that, like you mentioned, because these are really all over the map.
We can see the gross numbers. Like we can see that this one person in 2020 had a total wage of $3,600 and total health contribution of $24,000. That's on the public website. But what we'd like to know from HR, if they can, is to explain what that $24,000 is for. Like what kind of health plan is it? How many people does it cover? And why are some of the other council members getting such different amounts in their health contribution? And obviously we don't want to ask for anything confidential and we don't want people's names attached to this, but to the extent that HR can provide this in an anonymous way, it would be really helpful to know.
I will reach out and check.
Unless there's anything more here, I'm going to try to get us to conclude as close to 9 o'clock as possible, unless there's a real need to extend. The next item is election of officers for us.
Before that, I think there's also I don't know if...
subcommittee reorganization.
Yeah, I don't know if you are ready to reorganize or if you want to put that off and for the next meeting still, people who do research will just bring the data back like today and just discuss it together.
I'm grateful to the two of you for doing so much research, and I didn't do any, but I'd have to say that our plan from last time seems to have worked, but it's easy for me to say. So are you two comfortable with continuing following up on the things that you're already involved in?
I'm comfortable doing that, and I'm also comfortable not trying to come up with 2-member subcommittees for each item today, because I'm hoping that in our next meeting we'll have at least one more member, and maybe Miles' situation will resolve by then. So I think we can put off reorganizing the subcommittees into to the next meeting.
That's fine with me, and I can independently do follow up on voting age and a little bit of research into the council issue.
And how are we doing for time? We have just like a few minutes left. Do I hear a motion to extend this meeting by 10 or 15 minutes, just to give us enough time for our next agenda item?
I'll move
Yeah,
to
I can
ex-
make a motion to
Okay.
extend until 9:15.
I'll second.
Okay, if I agree with that.
Member Bowman,
Yes.
Member Chomsky,
Yes.
and Chair Schneider.
Yes.
So it's 9:15.
Okay. So the next item is election of officers, a chair and vice chair for us.
I nominate Member Bowman to be the chair.
And I second that.
Well, first of all, would Member Bowman accept that?
I am fine with that.
Accept the nomination? Okay, so.
Is
Member
it so? Is
Chomsky-
it calendar year based?
Yes.
Okay.
Member Chomsky moved and Member Schneider seconded. Member Bowman,
Yes, except
Member Chomsky, and Chair Schneider. But soon after.
Yeah, there. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so the motion passes for Member Bowman to be the next chair.
Okay. And then I move to nominate Member Chomsky for vice chair.
I'll accept that nomination.
Do we have a second? Well, actually,
We need a
yeah, do we
second.
have a second?
second.
Thank you. Okay, Member Bowman,
Yes.
Member Chomsky,
Yes.
Member Schneider.
Yes.
And Member Chomsky is the next vice chair. Okay.
Okay, do I go on to the next agenda?
I think it's okay for you to finish this
the
meeting
meeting.
and then.
Yeah, okay. Are there any future agenda items?
I would think it's reconvening on the next steps that we've identified here on these two issues.
And I would put the reorganization on the next agenda as well, since it's being postponed.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do we have to take any action on that reorganization, or is that just an option for us?
That's just an option.
Okay.
I mean, you don't have to reorganize if you don't want to.
So we don't really have to have subcommittees, right?
No, you don't.
Okay.
Okay. So any other future agenda items? And then I just wanted to state that the next meeting is scheduled for March 17th on a Thursday at 7 o'clock.
It sounds like we have public comment maybe about future agenda items.
Okay. Thank you for noticing that. I'm just not seeing the raised hands. I appreciate that.
Okay, Anne has put up the timer for 1 minute.
Jeremiah?
Hi, thank you. I was just kind of bring up the future agenda item for the 16-year-olds being able to vote in Albany. And that's it. Oh, and by the way, I sent an email to the school board regarding that, and hopefully someone reaches out to you.
Okay. Any other public comment?
No.
So I think we can clarify that the 16 and 17-year-old voting is on our work plan, so it's covered under work plan items progress report, which is the main item for our agenda next time. So,
Okay. Well, there being no further items on the agenda, this meeting is adjourned.